All right, welcome back for a few more minutes of analysis through these public sphere tenets here, the bullet points of the many things that the public sphere is or can do. And again, these are longer videos, much longer, a lot more video than I would include on most days, but this is kind of what the course is about. And so I want you to get as much of me showing you how these things work as possible. So, and hopefully you're excited to hear a few more minutes of me. All right, so we left off with this one, which I find really fascinating, may argue through non-traditional means. So not all the stuff that we saw from Sierra Club or Coca-Cola and logos or even typical use of emotion, whatever that might be, but rather culture jamming. And we saw these. We took a look at these. Now, here's one thing we might say about this, and it gets into another bullet point that hopefully you jotted down in your notes. These might not be very persuasive to people outside of the public or community that has these sort of anti-corporate beliefs in some way, especially pertaining to diet for these two, and just pertaining to large corporations selling things that aren't probably that good for our health purely for the sake of money, right? And we could tie this one in there too, as well as these two. That's what they all have in common. This is probably more to keep the membership happy, to keep them entertained, to remind them of what the values are. Another thing it probably does is marks whatever group uses this type of rhetoric, whatever public uses this, as somehow sort of street, somehow ironic, somehow sort of cool and underground or something like this, right? Being logical isn't necessarily that cool or underground or alternative or punk or whatever you want to call it. But this seems more that way, especially when you consider where it came from. If you're curious, just a brief history, it actually came from stuff like this. You can see this is Coca-Cola using the word love, trying to brand itself, saying, hey, don't worry about what we are or what we do. We're just love, right? But somebody has spray painted the word profit underneath here. And so that's back to our anti-corporate stance that you oftentimes get in culture jamming. It actually started from street artists back in the 70s and 80s, mainly in England, doing this sort of anti-corporate or sometimes sort of anti-war type of propaganda on street corners and stuff like that. If you're interested in this and it's just fun, you can type in Banksy, Banksy. And he is the one of the grandfathers, I guess we'll say, of this type of thing back in the 70s and 80s in England. Interesting guy. Anyway, so that's this, but remember, it's probably not highly persuasive to other people, like my grandmother or your grandmother or something like this. Rather, it's probably for the community itself to keep them happy. And that is the next one. That's G, as a matter of fact. May use communication to circle the wagons, to keep the interest and energy of people who are currently members of this. Sierra Club is doing some of that too, but in much, much different ways. They're not nearly as sarcastic or ironic or as underground as we see here. If you think this is just something that you'd send out as a meme or something like this, actually you can see culture jamming. There is the magazine Adbusters, which is a pretty fascinating magazine to look at. Highly political. And so this is about the Israeli army shooting on a group of civilians during a recent outbreak of violence and border crossing and stuff like this. So you can see this is not what you normally see in a magazine, but there it is, very much in your face, right? Again, we have to say, is this persuasive to people? Well, this might be, if we're thinking of this as Israel versus Palestine, clearly Israel looks to be the villains here, and these Palestinians are pretty innocent, right? And here we can see, too, that it's actually, although we could say that this is a liberal magazine, I suppose, or progressive in some way, and we would see the New York Times as that, it is completely distancing itself from the New York Times and other so-called liberal media, right? Clearly doing its own thing. And so in terms of being a public or a discourse community, it is separating itself from that sort of too easy slot that we might put things in as liberal or conservative or whatever it might be. Really interesting stuff. This will, again, will disappear eventually, as this video ages. I'll kind of take you through. We can see some really good sort of emotional type of stuff and logic in here. You could pause and read this for a minute. What I find interesting is right at the end, how aware are they of what they're doing? Here's how they're keeping up the maintenance of their community. Here's how they're building their public. I want to be a culture jammer, and then you can join, right? So really, really fascinating stuff too, but a completely different way of making their argument. And their magazine, which is in print form, is loaded with stuff like this. All right. So we'll keep moving. That's just one or a few examples of circling the wagons. All publics do it, as well as when they attempt to recruit new members. I won't show you examples of that. I think we've seen plenty of that, and we'll talk about that more in the second half of the course. May cooperate with other publics that have similar goals. Here, a real easy one is when environmentalists, which are usually seen as liberal progressive, voting more democratic perhaps than not, they oftentimes, though, team up with hunters when it comes to conserving lands, because hunters, too, care about the quality of the land, the safety of animals, especially if they're going to eat the meat. Even though hunters sometimes might be gun rights activists, and therefore maybe we see them as conservative in some way. But oftentimes, groups that seem to be in competition, at least in the way the media talks about it, or the simplistic way we think about it, oftentimes are not at all. And these groups work together. And that's one of the fascinating things about the public sphere, is that groups that sometimes are opposed, say when it comes to gun rights, we might see these two groups as opposed to each other. They will not be when it comes to conservation of maybe public land that could be used for hunting or for hiking, paddling, whatever it might be. And so there's a lot of cooperation in the same time that the same two groups might be in competition a bit later, a few years later, or perhaps even at the same time on a different issue. So fascinating stuff. J, values or major goals may be formed in direct opposition to competing groups' goals. Here what we might say is somebody like the Sierra Club, if we want to look back at their webpage. The things that they have on their webpage that they choose to care about that seem to be their major issues are to great degree informed by things that other people want, the groups that they're in competition with. So again, if that's one that came up recently was the selling of government lands that had been protected as a natural resource. There was a contingent of people in the U.S. government that wanted to sell them to local ranchers or just sell them to corporations, maybe big agricultural corporations or something like this, in order to pay off some of the debt or do something like this. And so Sierra Club then, what are they interested in? What's probably going to appear on their webpage? What are they talking about the most in public at that moment? Well, probably not selling off those lands. So to a great degree, the things that you care about or the specific issues that you're arguing about is oftentimes formed by what your competitors are doing in the public sphere. And if nobody's competing for a certain something you care about, you're not talking about it much. It might still be your value, but the things you choose to argue for are the things that are sort of under attack, so to speak. We saw this too in the recent healthcare debate about whether or not things should be public or private, right? And so that was nobody was really even talking about, whether or not healthcare should be private, as it has been in the United States historically, until President Obama said, hey, there should be this public option, right? The government should be involved and make sure that all people have, adequate access to healthcare. And then suddenly, there was, a certain defensiveness, and politicians and some corporations and industry, healthcare industry, moved toward, no, it should be privatized. They never even really felt the need to defend themselves until the opposite side, President Obama's mandate, said, hey, no, there should be a public option. So then suddenly it was a deal. It was an issue, right? Something that came up in the public sphere, in the media, etc. So that's another way that we are informed by the people we're in competition with. That's how the public sphere works. Last one, I won't say too much about. We've seen plenty of this, I think, but yeah, the use of genres, styles, and forms of communication that empower the group. It could be, legislative stuff. It could be logic, the rational, critical type of thing that you use. But it could also be, as we saw in the pro-life piece, grassroots, right? Remember our grassroots here. Trying to look like, hey, this is just people that are just like you. They got the same hat they bought at the same type of store that you buy it at, and they just wear t-shirts and they're out there, right? And so there's this type of idea too, that there's something simple and folksy going on here, and it's not all logic and academic argument and these types of things, right? And so we can see that expressed in this form of rhetoric as well. So just be aware of that. So what are the differences from a discourse community? There's many groups in contact with each other. The idea of a public suggests an active shaping of the world, something of politics or activism. Government, of course, can be part of this too. Coca-Cola, if we want to think of their sustainability movement, well, they're probably not a public per se, but they could be seen as a member of the sustainability public, and a pretty powerful one at that. Again, you could have a group of senior citizens that want to make their town more sustainable, But despite the fact that there's, I don't know, 10 senior citizens with lots of time on their hands, they have like no power at all, of course, compared to Coca-Cola, and what Coca-Cola could do if they really wanted to forward the idea of sustainability. Because then other soft drink companies, major corporations, will also want to be sustainable. If Coke is leading the way, they're seen as an industry leader. So there's lots of power for that single member of the public that is sustainability, right? And so there's that to contend with too. Some publics or some members of publics are much more powerful, especially when you get into the corporate or governmental worlds, versus just citizen groups. Last thing I might say here, or last couple things, the idea of a public or counterpublic suggests power again. That's what this is all about, power. Who's getting it? Who's got it? Some groups are always winning. Some groups are losing. Some groups use, maybe we'll go on to the last point here. Goals and demands at any time are likely influenced by the opposition's goals. And hang on, I lost my point. Yes, sorry, I was skipping around too much and getting ahead of myself. Basically, groups will use the type of communication that will empower them. Right. So if being logical isn't going to help, you're not going to have that much logic, right? And so we can learn a lot about a group and what they think works or what does work on their membership if they're able communicators by looking at their forms of rhetoric, right? And one thing we'll do more in this course as it continues is get beyond all of this logic and look at all the other things that people use to persuade. If there's one thing I'd like you to take away from today and all these different things that we looked at a fair amount of things, right? We looked at this, we looked at this. This, and this as well, right? So we looked at a lot of different things. And all of them are communicating and trying to persuade differently, right? And so there's a lot of different choices here, and I'd just like you to be aware of those choices and to start to analyze a group by their choices. And then the bigger question is, okay, they think that's what's working. What does the research say about what will actually work? And that's a bigger question that we'll start to tackle in the second half of the course. All right, I've got just a few minutes. I'm going to show you this real quick. This works well. We won't have time for it in this course, but in the face-to-face version of this course, I teach people this. Here's a great breakdown to cover all the different communities that are out there. This is based on environmentalism, but it could work for pretty much any topic, and students have used it outside of environmentalism for other topics. You can treat nature as an object. What groups typically do that? Traditional mainstream science and the government and all of their reporting and measuring and weighing of, chemical pollutants or what's going on in the Mississippi River or the pollen count this year or whatever it might be. You've got nature as a resource, and that's basically something to be made money off of or used for business practices, and we can see the two groups there. Now, that doesn't make them bad necessarily. There is responsible use of this resource, since we can think of it that way, and there's even corporate social responsibility, which says, hey, we should give back to the community. So while we're using up resources that we have to keep billions of people alive, what else can we do to promote good in the world? So we shouldn't see nature's resource as the villainous category, but it's more an issue of quality. How are we using this resource? And are we using it in a responsible way? But these are the two groups that do that. We can think of different types of farming, organic farming versus non-organic farming versus industrial farming, etc., etc. This will tie in, and these three will tie in very much to your next reading for the course, which is Silent Spring. I guess I forgot to mention that this is very, very useful for all your projects and thinking, but specifically it'll help you with Silent Spring. And the last group here, Nature is Spirit, basically environmentalists, but deep ecologists tend to believe that human life is no more important than any other life form. And social ecologists tend to believe that no, humans are more important. We just need to be careful with our use of resources and preserve the ecology. So even nature is spirit. There's something awesome and energetic about nature, and as well as ecological in some way. Well, that group breaks down too into different positions. So speaking of Silent Spring, what I want you to do is go in and analyze it through all the different types of things that you see in it that we talked about in today's videos. That's any aspect of a discourse community. The community is implied, the public's implied. Please use your D2L questions to get you going. Use everything from these videos, and also use this right here. What are the various groups that are implied in Silent Spring? It could be any of these, and this should get you going. So thank you for watching this series of videos. This should set you up well for the rest of the course. Thank you.